Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar featuring the always brilliant and insightful Caroline Glick discussing the perspective from Israel on various global events and changing geopolitical alliances. For those who don't know me, I'm Laurie Regan, Emmett's New York chapter president and board member, and I'm very happy to be moderating our discussion with Caroline this afternoon. Emmett's work is critically important in the fight for Israel's survival and for a strong U.S. national security, both of which are integrally tied together. And I believe today's discussions will help provide insights on both of those important policy objectives. So I thank you all for joining and supporting Emmett's work. As always, I'll ask you to please follow our work at www.emmettonline.org, and please consider making a financial donation. It's your support that enables us to continue our important work. Caroline Glick is a senior columnist at Israel Hayom, Israel's largest circulation newspaper, and at Newsweek. She is the host of the Caroline Glick Mideast News Hour podcast, which can now be viewed at the Jewish News Syndicate. She also served as senior columnist and senior contributing editor at the Jerusalem Post from 2002 to 2019, and as senior columnist at Maariv Hebrew newspaper from 2014 to 2019. Caroline is the author of two books, The Israeli Solution, A One-State Plan for Peace in the Middle East, and Shackled Warrior, Israel and the Global Jihad. The Israeli Solution was endorsed by leading U.S. policymakers, including Vice President Mike Pence, Senator Ted Cruz, and former National Security Advisor John Bolton. Shackled Warrior was endorsed by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former CIA Director James Woolsey. She is currently writing a book on the future of American jewelry. Caroline is the senior fellow for Mideastern Affairs at the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C. She travels worldwide to brief policymakers on issues related to Israel's strategic environment and related topics. She lectures widely on strategic and political issues affecting global security, Israel and the Jewish people, U.S.-Israel relations, Israel diaspora affairs, and Israel's changing strategic landscape. She's the founder and editor-in-chief of Lapid, a Hebrew language satirical television program now broadcast on Israel Channel 20. Caroline's writings have also been published in leading newspapers and journals, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, National Review, the Journal of International Security Affairs, and Commentary. She blogs at her website, www.carolineglick.com, and on her Facebook author page and Twitter. She is truly one of the most prolific, brilliant thinkers out there, and I urge you to follow her work as well. Today's webinar will be recorded and available for viewing at a later time. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please do not put any questions in the chat feature, and please keep your commentary in the chat to a minimum. I'll do my best to get to as many questions as possible a bit later in the program. Welcome back, Caroline, and thank you so much for being with us today. Guy Milliere wrote an article last December entitled, "Is the Biden administration at war with Israel?" The article was written before last week's announcement that Biden's new press secretary would be, like others in his administration, an openly proud Israel hater. But he went through the litany of anti-Israel personnel in the Biden-Harris administration, including folks like Rob Malley and Hadi Amar. He touched on Biden's desire to reverse much of Trump's pro-Israel policies, including reopening a Palestinian consulate in Jerusalem, providing the Palestinians with financial aid, despite U.S. laws such as the Taylor Force Act that prohibit that aid. And he, of course, discussed the administration's obsessive quest to sign a nuclear deal with Iran, no matter how awful it will be for both U.S. and Israeli security interests. And we will be talking shortly about the Iran deal. Now, the latest report on this topic is that during Biden's trip to the region next month, in a historic first, he is planning to make a stop at a Palestinian hospital in East Jerusalem, unaccompanied by Israeli officials, something that one Israeli journalist characterized as being, quote, a form of recognition that Jerusalem is divided, which is a complete reversal of Trump's policy. Do you believe the administration is actually anti-Israel? And what do Israelis more broadly feel about the U.S. as a reliable and consistent ally since Biden entered office?
Thanks so much for that question. I don't have right before me any polling data on it, but Biden is not considered pro-Israel by Israelis, and rightly so. His administration is the most anti-Israel administration we've ever seen, and this is true for a combination of reasons. I mean, in all aspects, in all major policies, Biden's policies are a continuation of the Obama administration's policies. So you could say, well, then he's just as hostile as Obama was, but he's not, because the Democratic Party in the intervening 5 years has become far more hostile to Israel, And as a result, the kind of buffers that you had, or the kind of blocks that you had acting on Obama in terms of empowered or more powerful moderates in the Democratic Senate or House majorities are much less powerful today. Their voices are not heard, and they have a much harder time fighting for pro-Israel policies. And it's interesting because the Rashida Tlaibs and Ilhan Omars and Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, who are openly anti-Israel and in certain cases in regards also openly anti-Semitic, are the minority in the Democratic caucus in the House. But Nancy Pelosi, who is not anti-Israel, is not anti-Semitic, gives them the rule of the roost. And so she's just given them the leadership of policy in determining the policy direction of the Democrats in the House. And as a result, they do. And the moderate pro-Israel Democrats really don't have a voice the way that they did in the past. They certainly don't dominate the discourse on the Democratic Party. To the contrary, they're largely, when they do speak out, and several of them did against the Iran nuclear deal a couple of weeks ago, they had a press conference about it. Still, their positions are very weak, and they go out of their way to not directly criticize Biden's policies in a way that makes their overall criticism less effective than it otherwise would be. Although they did have some effect in chilling the enthusiasm about taking the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps off of the State Department list of foreign terrorist organizations, which was a good thing, but it didn't change the ultimate direction of the administration's Iran policy, which is to give Iran nuclear weapons and call it a non-proliferation deal. So I think that it's the radicalization that we've seen in the Democratic Party, the domination of the woke crowd, which is inherently anti-Israel, in the party's politics and the policies that are being made by the party, that really have made Biden the most anti-Israel president we've ever seen, and his administration the most anti-Israel. The other thing that you can say about that is that there aren't any guardrails. There's no disparity between the positions of any of the people involved in Middle Eastern policymaking in the Biden administration, whether it's Meir Bitar, who's the director of intelligence in the National Security Council, who is an ethnic Palestinian and a BDS supporter and the leader of the BDS operations at Georgetown University when he was a student there, or Rima Dodin, who is the liaison between the White House and Congress, who is also has in the past, when she was a student, I think at Berkeley, spoken in favor of suicide bombers. Whether it's the new press secretary that you mentioned, Karine Jean-Pierre, who called AIPAC a racist organization, Islamophobic organization, and called for the Democratic presidential candidates in the Democratic primary in 2020 to boycott the AIPAC conference, which most of them did. She worked for MoveOn.org, which was one of the organizations that played a central role in mainstreaming anti-Semitism in the Democrat Party. Perhaps you remember really the beginning of the change in the Democrat Party came in the Senate elections in Connecticut when Joe Lieberman was running for re-election in 2006. And he was running against Ned Lamont, who is now the governor of Connecticut. And Ned Lamont in the primary ran an openly anti-Semitic campaign against Lieberman, and he was endorsed by Hillary Clinton. And he was run by MoveOn.org. So this organization was really the beginning of the transformation of the Democrat Party into a woke party, into an anti-Israel policy, and to an anti-Jewish policy party. So, this has been going on in the party for a long time. The people who were activists in this movement are now holding senior policy positions. You have Hadi Omar, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israel-Palestine. He is an Israel hater. He has a long history of being an Israel hater, and he's responsible for Israel policy with the Palestinians. So there's really nobody, and obviously Robert Malley, who hates Israel and supports Hamas and Hezbollah, even he has said nice things about them. And he's, as the U.S. envoy to talks with Iran, he's doing everything that he can to get a deal with Iran that will give Iran the nuke, a nuclear arsenal. So this is the Biden team. This is the state of the Democratic Party today. So that's really what makes the Biden administration so incredibly anti-Israel.
I would also add to that, there's a weird obsession with reversing everything Trump, and the reversing of all the wonderful things that Trump did in terms of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and that was pro-Israel, is something that the Biden administration seems to be like compulsively working towards reversing. So let's spend a few minutes now discussing the Iran nuclear deal. You and I were both very active in fighting the JCPOA well before it was finalized in 2015. And in fact, you joined us in Times Square for our rally to stop the deal that over 15,000 people attended. And your remarks were some of the most powerful that we heard. Since that time, the Mossad was miraculously able to obtain the treasure trove of Iran's nuclear archive, proving just how ineffective, naive, and disillusioned the Obama administration's policies were. Experts who understood just how awful the JCPOA was breathed a sigh of relief when Trump withdrew from that deal and implemented the maximum pressure campaign. Unfortunately, yet not unexpectedly, Biden, utilizing almost the exact same team of negotiators and Iran czars, as you point out, as that of the Obama administration, reversed this Trump policy and has either ignored or lifted sanctions, turning Iran's failing economy around, and is coming quite close to reentering the deal despite the bipartisan objections of Congress and other leading policy experts. Israel's foreign minister, Yair Lapid, has promised that Israel will not allow Iran to go nuclear, as has U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. But in reality, what does that really mean? Do you think Israel will go it alone if it has to, notwithstanding whatever threats Biden makes to try and stop an Israeli military intervention? And also, can you please touch on what that means for Israelis, who will likely be facing a barrage of tens of thousands of missiles and rockets from Hezbollah and Hamas?
Well, I want to start with part of your introduction about whether or not you thought, or you stated there, I don't know if you actually think of it, that Obama was naive in negotiating the nuclear deal, that he thought that he was actually getting a non-proliferation deal that was going to prevent Iran from getting a nuke or a nuclear arsenal. And I think that it's clearly not the case. I mean, Obama himself said that at the end of the lifespan of the deal in 2030, that Iran's breakout time to independent military nuclear capacity would be essentially zero. And that's a direct quote from Obama. So he knew that this was not a non-proliferation deal. He knew that this was a deal that gave the UN Security Council a legitimation of Iran's illicit nuclear weapons program. He knew all of these things and he went forward with it anyway. And he went forward with it, I think, out of, I think, first of all, that he was anti-American. I think he remains anti-American. I think he remains anti-American exceptionalism. I think that he remains certainly the unipolar world that emerged from the Cold War with the United States as the sole superpower after the collapse of the Soviet Union and before China began to rise as rapidly as it did with the help of the U.S. So I think he opposed that. I think he opposes it still, and he also, made it very clear, beginning really during his campaign in 2008, but also, and most notably and most memorably, in his speech before University of Cairo in June of 2009, just 6 months after taking office, or less than 6 months after taking office, that he really viewed Israel and America's Sunni allies in a negative way. He was extremely critical of Israel. He was extremely supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood in that speech and in that visit to Egypt. And he, from the outset, sided with the most destructive forces, the terrorists, the jihadists in the Arab world, whether it's Qatar or Iran, Turkey's Erdogan, or or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt against America's allies, the Mubarak regime, which was the anchor of the Sunni Arab alliance system with the United States or the Saudis, and then, of course, with Israel throughout his presidency. And he spoke on a number of occasions about the need to kind of balance U.S. allies by empowering America's enemies. And, I think I've written about it. They had this idea that that if the United States is inherently, systemically racist and has to exculpate its sin of racism, then obviously anybody who admires the United States, anybody who sides with the United States, anybody who fits sort of neatly into under the aegis of American superpower in the world is also fundamentally flawed. And so I think that it emanates from that, the animus towards the Sunnis, who had been, I wouldn't say totally loyal, but they had been pretty steady members of the U.S. Security architecture in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean, in the Indian Ocean, and so on and so forth. So I think, he looked askance at U.S. allies in part because they were U.S. allies, and he thought that the revolutionary spirit of the Iranians was authentic as opposed to the inauthentic Americanism or American exceptionalism. And I think that it was kind of also laced with anti-Semitism, which is sort of the Soviet non-aligned movement vintage. So I think, a lot of that was going on. So again, I think it's important because I don't think that his pursuit of the deal with Iran was naive. I don't think he was trying to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear power. I think he said it, that he was trying to balance the power of U.S. allies by empowering Iran. And that was because just as he doesn't really like America, he didn't really like America's allies. And so that's that. As to Israel going it alone, look, I think we're going to have to go it alone. I think that has always been our assumption. No, that's not true. I think it should have been our assumption since 2007, when the Bush administration's National Intelligence Directorate published the National Intelligence Estimate of Iran's nuclear program. It was in November of 2007. And they said that Iran had abandoned its nuclear weapons program in 2003. And this was false. But basically what the NIE did back then in November of 2007 is that it made it impossible for Bush, had he wanted to take any action against Iran's nuclear weapons program. Condoleezza Rice, in the meantime, was not at all interested in doing so. Neither was Karl Rove. So I think just looking at it from Israel, and I've been covering this story since 2003 when it was first exposed, when Iran's nuclear installations in Isfahan and I think Arak were first exposed by the Iranian Mujahideen al-Khalq opposition party. I think it was pretty clear to me, or I know it was clear to me already in November 2007, that the United States wasn't going to actually take any concerted action to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power, and that Israel was on its own. Israel's problem is that our military leadership, our national security leadership, and the Israeli left cannot be convinced by empirical evidence that the United States is not in Israel's corner on Iran. And they continue to believe that the United States has Israel's back in Iran, and that we can make a deal with the United States under which they will work with us to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear weapons wielding state. And so I think that the major problem here is that the IDF, the Mossad, large portions of it, certainly every director of the Mossad, aside from Yossi Cohen, believed that there was a deal to make with the United States, and the United States was going to be true to its word. As you mentioned, Tony Blinken said it most recently, that the United States was not going to allow Iran to acquire nuclear weapons. And as a result, Israel has been, I think, irresponsible in putting together the kinds of operations that we need to work independently. Now, the truth is that Benjamin Netanyahu did put together an independent operation in Iran to sabotage Iran's nuclear weapons program, to discredit internationally, of course, their pursuit of nuclear weapons, particularly in the United States. And he built an alliance structure with the Sunni Gulf states in particular, and also with Egypt, to check Iran's rise in power militarily, economically, through their boycott of Qatar, and through other means. That was very effective. But that alliance is falling apart now because the current Israeli government doesn't seem to understand why it was so important. They're much more keen to develop good relations with the Biden administration, with the Palestinians, with Jordanian King Abdullah, who was opposed to this alliance structure because it marginalized him, than they are in maintaining and expanding our strategic ties with the Sunnis. At least that's how it appears from the outside. I'm not speaking on the basis of any inside knowledge, but that's certainly what it appears from the outside. And the Americans are undercutting this alliance system with everything that they have, obviously in a passive aggressive way, because they're not going to say that they're trying to undermine the Abraham Accords, but they are. And I'll just give you one example, which is that last month, President Biden nominated the former Consul General in Jerusalem, Michael Ratney, to serve as the next U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And I'm just finishing a Newsweek column about it. The implication is very clear. First of all, it's a downgrade of U.S. relations with Saudi Arabia because Ratney is the first professional foreign service officer to be appointed to serve as ambassador to Riyadh since Chaz Friedman in 1989 under the first Bush presidency. The U.S. has traditionally appointed a senior, former general, somebody with very close ties to the military industry, somebody with very close ties to the president to serve in that role. And that's not what Ratney is. But the real reason why it's a statement of contempt really for the Saudis, and Saudis, by the way, always send a prince or now a princess who's very close to the leadership to serve as the ambassador to Washington. The other reason is because Ratney totally opposes the Abraham Accord. He is a guy who has a Palestinian-centric way of looking at the region. He was instrumental in funding the One Voice NGO in the 2015 Knesset elections here in Israel. One Voice was illicitly funded by the State Department to the tune of $350,000 to run a campaign to unseat the sitting government of Benjamin Netanyahu in those elections. And he basically, his appointment is, I think my colleague and friend Victoria Coates said to me this week that it's you couldn't be more clear that the U.S. opposes Saudi-Israeli peace if they had, hired an airplane and skywritten it across the sky. So Radney is there to undermine the burgeoning alliance between Israel and the Sunnis, and to undermine and to downgrade U.S.-Saudi ties in favor of U.S.-Qatari ties. The U.S. just made Qatar, which is a prolific state sponsor of terrorism, a major non-NATO ally, and to upgrade U.S. ties, of course, with Iran in the framework of the nuclear deal. So Israel needs to be able to attack Iran. Right now, we're taking limited operations against Iranian and Hezbollah forces in Syria. This is a long-standing mission that we've been conducting really since the Syrian civil war to prevent the transfer of sophisticated weaponry to Hezbollah in Lebanon through Syria. And those operations are important. Yair Lapid, who said that Iran will not be allowed to get a nuclear weapon, has also said from the outset of this new government that Israel wasn't going to surprise the Biden administration. Since the Biden administration opposes all offensive operations against Iran, which it's trying to empower, not surprising the Americans means giving them veto power over Israeli operations in Iran. And not surprisingly, with this being the policy of the Israeli government, the number of sabotage operations inside of Iran's nuclear installations has vastly decreased since the installation of this new government a year ago.
So we're going to talk more about the Abraham Accords in a couple minutes, but focusing on the Israeli government still, you and Ron Dermer and a few other high-profile Israelis have criticized the current Israeli coalition government for not being more outspoken about the deal. In a recent column, you concluded, quote, the contest between Iran and Israel pits a country of 90 million against a country of 9 million, a theocratic regional hegemon with manifold foreign legions against a liberal democracy with no aspirations for territorial conquest. And under the Biden administration, the U.S. is standing with the Iranians, end quote. Mm-hmm. Can you just briefly share what approach you believe Israel should be taking, given the complicated nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship? And also, can you talk about how the negotiations are playing out within Israel's political environment and any role that a deal or no deal will have on impacting the ability of this very fragile governing coalition remaining together? Perhaps Iran has nothing to do with this governing coalition at this point, since it seems, to be at sort of at the end of its time. But I am curious as to what you would recommend the Israeli government do at this point, or be saying at least.
Well, look, I believe that the rule of thumb with Israeli foreign policy, and probably the foreign policy of just about every country in the world, is that you should always be selling. You should always be advancing your interests. And if you're not advancing your interests, you can be absolutely certain that nobody else is. Israel has an interest in an existential interest in Iran not becoming a nuclear armed state, not developing nuclear weapons, not completing the nuclear fuel cycle, not having the capacity, which the deal, by the way, gives them, to develop centrifuges, as they already have, but even more advanced centrifuges that will give them the ability to enrich weapons-grade uranium very quickly and in large quantities. So Israel has an existential interest in advancing all of these goals. And one of the main things that you do to advance a goal is to talk about it and to attack anything that impedes it, both publicly and kinetically. And we haven't seen any of that happening. So I think that Ron is absolutely right. Look, Naftali came to the United States to meet with Biden, I think it was in August, and he didn't meet any Republicans. His government, Yair Lapid, has very close ties with the Democratic Party. A Democratic strategist, Ken Melman, is his political strategist and guru, and ran his election campaigns, and he's in constant contact with him on a whole host of issues. So he's very keen to develop and maintain close ties with Democrat players. The problem is, again, as I said at the outset, is that the Democrat Party has changed. I mean, this is certainly not the Democrat Party that we knew in the 1970s or the 1980s, and it's not even Clinton's Democratic Party. It's got nothing to do with that. This is a woke revolutionary party. It is led by woke revolutionaries who hate the United States and hate Israel. So when you're trying to develop ties with them, that's all well and good, but your friends in the Democrat Party aren't actually doing anything to wrest control over the policy making away from the woke revolutionaries, and in a way reasonably, because they're intimidated, because these people are scary and violent and intimidating. But that's what's happening on the Democratic side. And on the other hand, we have a lot of friends on the Republican side. I dare say just about every Republican practically. And I can count on the fingers on one hand the number of Republicans whom I'm not quite clear that they're friends with Israel at all. And they should be spoken with. They should receive information. They should be helped. I mean, they don't want Iran to become a nuclear power. They understand that the nuclear deal does just that, and that it's dangerous, and that overall Biden's Middle East policy is antithetical to U.S. national security interests, and of course to Israel's national security interests, and indeed to its survival. But they need to be given attention as well, and they're largely being ignored. And this is a really big problem. And if you're not preaching to the choir, then the choir isn't going to come to church, because, if you just look at the current events and what's happening in the United States, this is a cascade. There's a cascade of urgent issues requiring the attention of lawmakers, requiring the attention of Republican leaders on every level of governance. So if you're not engaging them with the things that are important in the Middle East, then they're going to be engaged with leaks of, draft Supreme Court decisions overturning Roe v. Wade and any number of other things that are happening in the United States today, rising crime rates, et cetera. So Israel has to make itself available and work with its friends. And again, that's the second rule, I think, with politics and with statesmanship, in my opinion, which is not only do you have to advance your interests, but you have to help your friends, and you have to harm your enemies, because then people will want to be your friends and they won't want to be your enemies. And when Israel ignores our best friends in Washington and in the United States, whether it's the evangelical Christians or the Republicans, and works all the time catering to the Democrats in the hope of developing close ties with them, or with the State Department, which is, just as everybody here I'm sure knows, is institutionally hostile to Israel and has been since before Israel declared independence in 1948, then you're not going to get very far. And as to, what would be the impact of the conclusion of an Iran nuclear deal or even the negotiations, now the problem here is that, it's that we have a situation with the media that's unprecedented in Israeli history, which is that every single major media organization in Israel supports the prime minister 100%. He has 4% support among the public, and he has 99% of support among reporters. And as a result, there's no real discussion of the things that undermine his position. And so the discourse on Iran has been limited, and it has been anodyne. It hasn't pointed out the dangers of what's happening in a significant way. And I'm talking about, 3 out of our 4 television channels, and all but 1 or 2 of the radio stations, and all of our print media today are very, very pro Bennet, and are trying to hide a lot of what's happening. And the most obvious example of that is the fact that this government is completely dependent on the Muslim Brotherhood for its survival. We have a coalition member, and initially I kind of thought that it was an interesting thing that was happening. I wasn't sure whether to think it was a good thing or a bad thing, but we have our Islamist political party, RAM, the United Arab List, that decided that it wanted to join a coalition, that it wanted to join a governing coalition. This is the first time that an Arab party wanted to do something like this. And initially I thought it was a good idea, because I thought, gee, maybe Mansour Abbas, the head of the party, was sort of an Arab-Israeli translation of the Abraham Accords and normalization, and the expression of an aspiration by Arab Israelis to want to become fully integrated into Israeli society as Arabs, not as Jews. And I thought that that was great, or at least worth a shot. But this experiment has failed, and it failed pretty quickly, because it works out that no, in fact, this isn't a movement that looks like an Israeli Arab translation of the Crown Prince of the UAE, who's very, very keen to normalize Arab relations, pan-Arab relations, and certainly UAE-Israel relations with the Jewish state generally, and for his country specifically, or the Bahrainis, or even the Moroccans. This is something completely different. This is it's a version of Israel by the Muslim Brotherhood. I just wrote in my column for Friday's Israel Hayom about the fact that Abbas is carrying out an independent foreign policy that is hostile to Israel's core interest of sovereignty. Abbas, working with King Abdullah in Jordan, is trying to cancel Israel's sovereignty over the Temple Mount. And he's making headway, as you mentioned, with the Biden administration. Biden's plan to visit Al-Muqassid Hospital in East Jerusalem without any Israeli participation in the visit is not at all symbolic expression of his willingness to see Israel lose its sovereignty over at least parts of its capital city. And this is now U.S. policy under Biden. He is making headway. Jordan, in his name, in a coordinated manner, just presented a list of demands to the Biden administration regarding the Temple Mount, and this is after the Palestinian Arabs on the Temple Mount rioted violently throughout the month of Ramadan and were incited not only by Hamas, but also by the Islamic movement that Abbas is the deputy head of, and also by Jordan and also by the Palestinian Authority to attack Jews. And in Abdallah's list of demands on the Temple Mount, regarding the Temple Mount that he submitted to the White House, I think 2 days after he met for 4 hours with Mansour Abbas in his palace in Amman. He says, among other things, that the Waqf should get to dictate which non-Muslims are allowed up on the Temple Mount. They want to dictate a dress code for Jews who would be allowed to, who would have to wear it in order to come to the Temple Mount. Jews would have to present or submit a written request to the Waqf ahead of time to be allowed to come up to the Temple Mount. They would restrict the space on the Temple Mount that non-Muslims would be allowed to walk through, and other incredibly racist positions that they've just submitted to the Biden administration. And Biden, rather than throw them out of the room, has agreed to meet with King Abdullah to discuss their list of demands, which is just openly anti-Semitic. And additionally, from a strategic perspective, they're demanding that Israel police not to be allowed to come into the mosque. So this is just an abrogation of Israeli sovereignty. And all of this is coordinated with Abbas. And so when you look at how dangerous this is, that we have an enemy of Israel that's tied to international actors, not only the King of Jordan, but also Turkey's President Erdogan. Abbas just was in Turkey, apparently, reportedly, over the past several days. The Islamic movement in Israel runs at least 2 nonprofit organizations in Turkey that operate in conjunction with Turkish NGOs that are aligned with Hamas. And yet he controls the government. If he leaves the government, we go to elections. And so Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz are all completely dependent on Mansour Abbas in order to keep their jobs. And that's where we are today. So you have a press that won't cover the dangers in a significant way, or with any. It's not that the press coverage here isn't significant. It's that it isn't urgent. And then the other thing is that we have a government that's completely dependent on the Muslim Brotherhood for its survival.
Yeah. So there's a lot of questions in the queue, and I have still a couple of mine. I'm going to ask you 2 more questions before we go to the Q&A of the audience. And again, if anybody has a question, you can put it down below. There's a Q&A button on your screen.
I'll try to keep my answers shorter then.
No. Your answers are very insightful, and there's a couple things I wanted to hit on before we do open it up to the audience. And one of them, you did bring up the Abraham Accords. And look, the geopolitical implications of this administration's foreign policy decisions, including the Afghan withdrawal, are reaching far and wide. Given this state of affairs, and including the renewed U.S. approach of putting daylight in the U.S.-Israel relationship, which we've talked about, what do you see happening with the Abraham Accords and the alliances that formed out of those? The U.S. administration wouldn't even use the term Abraham Accords initially, and after alienating the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others when Biden entered office, we now learn of the Saudis and Iranians meeting. So in another column that you were discussing the work of your Center for Security Policy colleague, David Wormser, who has appeared for us in the past, you wrote that, quote, U.S. concessions to the Iranians mean that the United States has withdrawn its protective umbrella from the Arabs in Israel. By removing its protection from its allies, the United States has signaled that their lives, property, and very existence are forfeit. Do we now have to worry that the Biden administration has pushed or is pushing some of these Gulf nations into relations with Iran? And are the days of expanding the country signing normalization agreements with Israel over for now?
Look, I don't think, I mean, I think the Arabs aren't stupid. They don't have a death wish. And so, they don't want, and we see this, they don't want to have to cut a humiliating surrender deal with Iran, because they understand, as well as Israel does, or as well as most Israelis do, just how that Iran is not just an existential threat to Israel, it's an existential threat to the Saudis, to the UAE, to Bahrain, and to all of these countries, to Morocco, to Sudan, to Oman, to all of these countries. So they all understand that. And they all very, very much want Israel to work with them. I mean, the Bahrainis and the UAE really couldn't be any more open about it. They're sending Air Force jets to Tel Aviv and, talking in their press when Aviv Kochavi, the chief of staff of the army, comes to visit. They make a big deal out of it. They believe in Israel, they believe in Israeli power, and they want a military alliance with Israel. I mean, Israel has to be careful that it's not saying, oh yeah, we're going to guarantee your security, because we can't, but I mean, and we oughtn't, we're not going to be sending our soldiers to Abu Dhabi, to protect them. But we would send our soldiers to Abu Dhabi to carry out operations in Iran to protect both of us, and acting in conjunction with them. And that's certainly what we should be doing. But again, this is one of the grave dangers that we have with the current government. It's sort of funny. I always, when I was, in the past, I tweeted predominantly in English and occasionally in Hebrew, but because the situation here is so alarming, and, so much of it is sort of a mirror image of what's happening with the Biden administration in the United States in terms of how they're undermining American sovereignty and American nationalism, and the same thing happening here in Israel to the Jewish national character of this country and our core interests with this government. I find myself 80-90% of my tweets now are in Hebrew. Because it's very alarming what's happening in Israel today. And so, now I lost my train of thought, so maybe go to the next question.
That's okay. No, you pretty much answered what we were talking about. So going on,
just one last thing. Israel has to work with the Sunnis. I mean, those relations weren't made, as Israel's left and some in the United States, American Jews said, to try to make Netanyahu look good before elections, or make Trump look good for elections, or try to, I don't know whatever other self-centered idea that's, some Netanyahu hater or Trump hater had in his head. These strategic relations were actually born during the Obama administration, when the Obama administration began siding with Iran and with the Muslim Brotherhood during the Arab Spring. And the Arabs looked around and they saw Benjamin Netanyahu outspokenly opposing US policies and protecting and supporting Egypt and Mubarak, and later Sisi after the overthrow of Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood government in 2013. And they said, wait a minute, Israel? Gee, we should be working with them. They're powerful. They're not scared to stand up for their interests. We should stand with them because we have the same interests. Whoa, who could have thunk it? And that's what they were born of. They were born of a sense of urgency and existential worry, and most importantly, shared strategic interests. And, these interests are not going away, and the urgency isn't going away. And the existential threat that Iran poses and the Muslim Brotherhood poses to all of these countries is not going away. So, I mean, I believe that these alliances will last and persevere despite, the degeneracy of the Israeli government, because there's no alternative. There's no better alternative to them, and they'll disappear when there is one. But, I'm very hopeful that this government will fall in the next couple of months, but you never know, because you have a lot of desperate people who don't have a future in politics, and they're not going to want to go to new elections anytime soon.
Right, right. Well, so similar to the point that you made about the Obama administration sort of pushing these alliances out of need, did the Obama White House and now the Biden White House push Israel into developing relationships with Russia and China that are problematic for the U.S.? The delay in Israel taking a forceful stand against Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for instance, was a result of Israel needing to maintain decent relationships with Russia in order to continue its defensive measures in Syria. And China's investments in development in Israel are growing exponentially. You noted in a column that Bennet and his advisors don't understand that Washington has betrayed Israel and that Israel needs to find its way outside of America's security umbrella. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on the long-term stability of Israeli-Russia and Israeli-Chinese alliances in terms of Israel national security? And what does all this mean for Israeli-U.S. relations?
Yeah, I just want to start with a parenthetical remark about Russia and Ukraine. I don't actually understand what game Biden is playing with Russia. I mean, it's obviously true that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was unjust and wrong, and the bombing that they're undertaking in Ukraine is wrong. But it's also true that Ukraine is on Russia's border, and the United States, I don't see its strategic interest in going to war against Russia over Ukraine. And yet the United States is making all of these statements that indicate that they're openly using Ukraine as a proxy to fight a war against Russia. So, I mean, I got to say, $50 billion in arms to Ukraine, none of this really makes sense to me because I don't really understand what the Americans' endgame is here. And I just find it all very puzzling. And it sort of goes into an overall puzzlement about what possible American national interest is advanced by what they're doing with Iran, what they're doing with China, what they did with Afghanistan, and on and on. And obviously on the southern border. So, I mean, the fact that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is terrible is not necessarily a casus belli for the United States, particularly when America kind of needs Russia in its fight against China, and instead it lost India to China and to Russia over the war in Ukraine. I mean, I think I look at what's happening with the United States and Ukraine as another indication that the United States is not behaving rationally under the Biden administration, or you just can't understand the animating concept at work here. At least I can't. Now, having said that, Israel doesn't have the option of exchanging, we're not Egypt. We can't exchange the United States for the Soviets or for the Russians. We're not Saudi Arabia that can just say, okay, we're going to set aside, we're going to abandon the petrodollar, and we're going to start selling oil to China in Chinese currency. Israel's only option other than strategic dependence on the United States is strategic independence. And I think that that's the direction that we should be going. I mean, I've for years been advocating that Israel end our military aid from the United States. I think it undermines our military industries, and it perpetuates a psychological dependence on the Pentagon and on the United States. It's not good for either of us. Not good for the United States and for the health of our relationship, and not good for Israel and our strategic independence. And I mean, I spoke about this on television a couple of weeks ago, that one of the alarming things that I'm hearing now is that Israel has developed laser technology that can replace the Iron Dome. And we're developing it. And it's supposed to take about a year or two to be operational. And so whereas every Iron Dome missile costs something like, I don't remember how much, $50,000, $100,000, the use of laser will essentially be free once you've developed it. And now suddenly the defense ministry wants to get America to fund the development of it. And we're not talking about a lot of money here. We're talking about a couple 100 million shekels. And this is money that Israel certainly has on its own. And we shouldn't be asking the United States to fund it, A, because it deepens our strategic dependence on the United States. It prevents this weapons program or technology from being Israeli, and it becomes controlled effectively by the Pentagon. And why would we do that? So it just bespeaks the kind of pathological nature of the thinking of our military brass, that they still don't understand that what we should be aspiring to is not to necessarily, we should definitely want to rebuild our relations with the United States, but that's much more dependent on the United States because the United States is the side that broke them. But Israel, under all conditions, even under the best conditions, when we have a president as supportive as President Trump, we should be independent because it makes us a better ally for the United States. That's what Trump really admired in Israel. And that's what he saw in Israel, was that we didn't want or need US boots on the ground to defend ourselves. So his whole concept of American exit from the Middle East and ending the endless war in the Middle East was to empower America's allies to fight them themselves. And that was what made him so revolutionary as an American president in the Middle East, because Americans have traditionally viewed their Middle Eastern allies, and I dare say their European allies as well, as client states. And where Trump came in on this was, why should they be clients? Why can't they just be allies? Why can't they be partners? That's what he was saying to America's NATO allies. You should be able to defend yourselves. And for Israel, it was an extraordinary change in US policy, and it was for the better. And it was obviously for the better for the United States, because the more that to the extent that US allies are capable of protecting their own interests, and their interests are aligned with America's national interests, then that means that it's a twofer to support them, right? And you do it with minimal American investment. So, that's the kind of relationship that we should want under all circumstances. And it's much easier for both sides to get it if Israel restores its strategic independence.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm going to go to the audience questions now, and there's quite a lot of them. How do you feel about a possible rapprochement between the UAE and the Syrian regime? What risk does a better relationship between Syria and its Arab neighbors pose to Israel?
Well, I mean, Syria is not a country. Syria is an Iranian satrapy. It doesn't have any independent existence. And now with to a certain extent, Russia's military presence in Syria has acted as a block on Iran's control over events in that country, and mitigated to a certain degree its control over the Assad regime. But the UAE's desire to restore Syrian membership in the Arab League, among other things, I think is a very terrible idea. I think, because again, this is, and it's been the case for a very long time that Syria is not an independent state, that it is controlled by Iran, just as Lebanon is controlled by Iran through Hezbollah, which is Iranian. It's not a Lebanese force, it's an Iranian force it's like a foreign legion. It's Iranian, but it's staffed by Lebanese Shiites, but they're controlled completely by the Revolutionary Guard Corps. And so, when you look at these countries, because they remain, they have the same names that they've always had, but they're no longer independent countries in any way. And when you look at them as independent countries, you're not seeing reality. So if you think that bringing Syria in is going to empower Assad somehow against Syria, against Iran, you're not looking at the situation as it is. Again, Assad, it's not a question of, he would choose the Arabs over the Iranians. He's not in a position to choose. He's not a person. He's a straw man. He's somebody that the Iranians hide behind.
The next question, why are Biden and Bennet meeting? What will Bennet give to Biden?
Well, I don't know. That's what I'm very afraid of. I'm
Yeah.
hoping that the meeting won't happen. Because again, under the circumstances, and it gives me absolutely no pleasure to say this, but I think that the people who are most harmed by Biden are the American people. So in a way, I mean, I think, at least we're not directly under the thumb of this government that really is undermining the United States of America first and foremost at home. But I mean, he has nothing positive to offer Israel because his policies in the Middle East, all of them, and certainly all of his policies towards Israel, are anti-Israel. They all undermine Israel in a million different ways. So I think, it's almost like, the when the guy comes up to the rabbi and fiddles around the roof and says, is there a proper blessing for the czar? And the rabbi says, may God bless and keep the czar far away from us. I think that sort of the sense that many people in Israel have about Biden's visit, which, he maybe once he changed the subject from inflation and a sputtering economy and the stock market crashing and all of that. Maybe he wants to change the subject and try to build up his foreign policy bona fides by bullying Israel. This is not in Israel's interest, and I would like to believe that it wasn't that Bennet invited Biden, but that Biden informed Bennet that he was coming, because Israel doesn't have anything to gain from this.
Right, right. So our friend Claire Lopez has posted a question. Is it perhaps even more likely that the Saudis, et cetera, would seek a nuclear weapons capability of their own than to seriously make up with the Iranians? The Crown Prince Abdullah traveled to Islamabad in 2003 to meet with AQ Khan. Isn't proliferation the most serious threat here, as GCC, et cetera, see U.S. as withdrawing our protection from them?
Oh, I mean, Claire, you make an excellent point. Absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's not just Saudi Arabia. It's also Egypt. They will. I think Russia now signed a deal to develop nuclear installations in Egypt, or maybe they signed it in the past under the Obama administration, and they renewed the deal now under the Biden administration. The Saudis have long had, basically a nuclear bomb on the shelf in Islamabad waiting for them, from what I understand. And these, what's sad about all of this is that these are all conversations that we were having during the Obama years, and then they were sort of put on the sidelines during the Trump years because America was back and rebuilding its alliances and looking like it was serious. And now the Democrats are back in power, and they completely reversed everything that Trump did. And so we're having the same discussions again.
Do you think that Russia's permanent presence in the Eastern Mediterranean will pose the greater threat to Israel in the future?
It could. I mean, it really depends. I don't. Russia, I don't even know exactly how to characterize Russia's view of Israel right now. Putin had a very good relationship, weirdly, but he had an excellent relationship with Netanyahu, and he presented himself to the Israeli public as probably the first Russian leader in history who wasn't anti-Semitic. But the defense ministry in Russia has a traditional anti-Semitic worldview. Shoigu, the defense minister, said some pretty horrible things about Jews. And Lavrov just made this totally obscene statement about Hitler being Jewish. I mean, there are plenty of anti-Semites in Russia. And if Putin falls on a banana peel and is replaced by somebody, I'm sure that whoever replaces him is going to be extremely hostile to Israel. Because they all have been. This is the traditional Russian policy. So it would be very strange if it wasn't. I mean, the deviation from the norm has been Putin in this respect. And I think that, Israel's Me Too policy of just standing with, saying whatever the United States says about Ukraine, when it's not even clear why the United States is saying what it's saying about Ukraine, is not a very wise thing to do when you have Russia in control of some pretty significant strategic real estate in Syria along the Mediterranean, and they're also developing much closer ties with Egypt today.
So I'm going to ask one more question since our time is winding down, and I'm going to follow in the footsteps of my dear friend Shoshana Bryan, who loves to end her webinars on a positive note. So someone put a question in the queue saying, Caroline, do you have any hopeful things to say about the future for Israel and for peace?
I do. I mean, look, I think we're in a very bad spot right now. I think the United States is in a terrible spot right now. We have a terrible government, and a lot of the problems that Israel has domestically that Netanyahu didn't take care of during his 10 years in office are really coming and becoming really big problems that, and we just had a new poll come out that showed that 75% of Arab Israelis don't believe that Israel has a right to exist, which is, makes for nice bedtime reading. But, Israel has a very young population. It has a very highly educated population. It has a very patriotic population. We're very powerful, industrially, economically, militarily, and from a social perspective, religiously, culturally. And so we do have everything going for ourselves. We have significant problem with the current government being fatally flawed on a lot of, very important things. But a lot of things are happening here in Israel that shows that the country can also move forward on autopilot. Our economy continues to grow at a very fast clip, and I think that the future is ours to take, but we have to have the wisdom to understand realities that we live in. And we have to have the courage of our convictions to stand up for who we are and to fight for it. We are facing, my husband always says to me, look, the Arabs in Israel are a mobilized society, and they are, and you can forget about it because they're integrating. But at the end of the day, they're very mobilized in the Palestinian Arab cause of Israel's annihilation. And I think that we just have to wake up the vast majority of Israelis who are Jewish to the fact that we have to be mobilized as well. And I think that that's already happening. It's happening because of the dire implications of us standing down from our guard. But it's also happening because Israelis really are committed to this country. And so I think, we have all the tools to succeed. We have the human capital, we have the financial resources, we have the industrial know-how and capabilities, and we have the military capabilities to withstand every obstacle, to withstand every threat, to defeat our enemies. We just have to renew our belief in ourselves, and I think that that's happening in response to this government, and I think that it's going to continue to happen because that's who we are. I hope that the United States is able to restore its sanity and restore its exceptionalism, and that it stops being a partisan reality. I hope that, I pray for it all the time, and I am more convinced though, and I'm more optimistic about Israel, and I'm very hopeful that we're going to see things change also politically in the near future, and by God's grace, we'll continue on and upwards and onwards.
Well, I always say that one of the biggest differences between American Jews and Israeli Jews is Israeli Jews have a survival instinct. And I think that's critically important. And I wish that American Jews had it as well.
Well, that's a totally different conversation.
Yes,
we'll have that when my book comes out.
We're going to wait for your book. And I do want to say that I did see somebody post in the chat that they certainly wish that you were the next prime minister, Caroline. So there's a lot of us that feel the same way. But
I appreciate that, but I can assure you that I won't be. So, we'll just have to do what we can from where we are, right?
Well, you're doing quite a lot from where you are, and we thank you for all the work that you're doing. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And we look forward to chatting again in the future. Everybody, please follow Caroline's work. It's critically important. Thank you.
Thanks. And I want to thank Bennet, and I want to thank Sarah Stern and Lori Regan and the whole gang. You guys do terrific work, and you're incredibly important in what you do. And I thank all the people here for supporting what you do. And again, go to carolineglick.com for all my latest.
Okay, thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Take care.